Namaste and in-law catch. Welcome to this episode of One World in a New World. I'm your host, Zen Benefiel, and as always, I'm going to draw attention to those two phrases. Namaste comes from the Sanskrit, spoken it's called Brahmi, and it means the divine in me recognizes the divine in you. In-law catch comes from the other side of the world, the Mayan culture, and it simply means I am another you. Now think about those two ancient cultures and the gifts that they gave us long ago. What if we applied that today? What if you applied that in your life and how you greeted others and how you perceive others? What a difference that can make. But don't believe me, try it yourself and you'll find out. Great. So this week's guest is Stephan Schwartz. He is a scientist, a futurist, an award-winning author and novelist. He's a columnist for the Journal of Science and Healing. He's the editor and publisher of the Schwartz Report. His book, 8 Laws of Change, got a Nautilus Book Award for Social Change in May of 2017. And he has a plethora of peer-reviewed articles on academia.edu. Now, he's a distinguished consulting faculty of Saybrook University, a fellow of Williams James Center for Consciousness Studies, Sophia University, and a research associate of the Cognitive Sciences Laboratory of the Laboratories for Fundamental Research. Stephan, glad to have you here.
Well, pleasure to be with you.
Wonderful. So, most of our conversations are about some very deep things and their beginnings in life. And you being a scientist, especially in the science and healing realm, when you first began to understand that there was more to reality than just the outer experience, and maybe you had an inner voice, maybe you had an experience or a dream or a vision or something like that. I'm curious, and I'm sure our audience is too. When did it start and how did that initially evolve in your awareness and your consciousness as to those other connections that are available?
Well, I've been at this a long time. I woke up when I was 24 years old. I was then at that point, I had just gotten out of the Army. I'd been drafted. I'd been working for National Geographic, and I'd gone to New York. I was a screenwriter, and I was working on a movie. And I went to a party that Truman Capote gave out on Fire Island. And as I was walking down, I went to the bathroom, and as I was coming back down the hall, looking at all these famous people, there was an old gold gilt mirror. And I looked in it, and without any anticipation of why I would say that, or without any intention to say it, I said to myself in the mirror, you are becoming an unattractive person. Your values are all screwed up. And I didn't know what that meant. I mean, I was doing all the things you were supposed to do, and I was being pretty successful at it. And anyway, I left the party and sat up on the beach all night, and in the morning went into New York and got in my car and drove back to Virginia, which is where I'm from, to my family's property, the family's farm, down in Gloucester County, Virginia, in the Tidewater. And there's the only time in my life I've ever been depressed.
Well, your comment to yourself would be a little depressing, telling yourself that, you're not making it, dude. So what's up with that?
Something right, but I didn't know what it was. And I was just in deep funk. And I was sitting there one day on the porch, the screen porch of my family's house, and which looking out over Montauk Bay, and I saw this couple walking in the gardens, and this was a property that had been deeply loved, had been in my family for many years, and had lovely gardens. And this couple was walking in the garden, and they were dressed like they were in Manhattan, which was very odd.
Mm-hmm.
And the farm was down at the end of an 8-mile school bus road that wasn't even paved, and our lane was the drive to down into the property was a mile long. So it was just not a place you got to casually. And I looked over at the where the cars parked and no car, and they saw me looking at them, and they came up to the screen door, and I opened the door, and they came in. And this woman, instead of introducing themselves, the first thing she said to me was, "Do you believe in reincarnation?" And I had never thought about it. I had grown up in a family that had two interests: consciousness and medicine. My father was a doctor, my mother was a nurse, and they had no interest in religion whatever.
Kind of Western medicine in an inducted, I guess, for lack of a better.
Well, yeah, my dad was an anesthesiologist, and anyway, I looked at this woman, and I mean, normally you introduce yourself.
Oh, yeah.
And I said to her, "Well, I never thought about it. I don't know anything about it, but I probably do because it seems very symmetrical." And I said to her, but wait a minute, I mean, who are you? Why are you here? And they introduced themselves as Ed and Paula Fitzgerald. And I looked at this guy, and he looked kind of familiar in a way. And then I realized I had seen him at a film conference up in New York. And I said to him, "Are you the Ed Fitzgerald who was the production designer for Magnificent Seven," which was then a very popular movie?
Right.
And he said yes. And so that gave them a little more gravitas and a little less weirdness. and I said to her, "Well, how did you get here? I mean, how did you know to come here?" And she said, "Well, I had a dream, and in the dream, I saw where all the turns were, and when I woke up, I wrote them all down, and we just drove it." And which I didn't know how to handle that because there wasn't any car. And she said, I had this dream, and it told me to come up and invite you down to Virginia Beach. Do you know who Edgar Cayce is? And I said, no. And she said, well, do you know anything about clairvoyance? And I said, no. And she said, well, I don't know why, but I was supposed to invite you down to come down to Virginia Beach. And I said, oh, that's okay. And she said, would you like to meet Thomas Jefferson? And I'd gone to University of Virginia. So Mr. Jefferson founded the university, and
right.
Of course, is a big figure in American history. And I said, well, yeah, is he back? And she said, yes, he is. So it's just very strange. Anyway.
Yeah. And so what else was, as you were going through this, I understand that the story is a wonderfully imbued with otherworldliness, but what was really going on inside of your head during that time?
Who are these people and why are they here? And what do you mean a dream told you to come up and do it? I mean, it just didn't make any sense at all to me. But anyway, just as we were talking, this car drove down the road, down the lane. This young couple was driving it, and she said, give me your telephone number, and I did. And they said, thank you very much, and they got in the car and drove away. And I thought, what the hell just happened? What was that all about?
Yeah, these people from outer space or what?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that was exactly the way I felt about it. Anyway, about a week later, remember, I was very depressed because I didn't know what to do.
Sure.
I mean, I had been successful. I was making money. I had this little Mercedes convertible, blah, blah, blah. I'm 23 years old.
Now, were you also kind of just with it, holding a question and empty inside as far as, being bereft of the answer?
I didn't know what the answer was. I had not realized that I felt that I was not, my values were not correct. I didn't know what to do with it. I mean, that's the only way I can describe it to you. I just didn't know what to do. Anyway,
Sure.
I got a call from this guy, and he said, "This is T.J. Davis, Thomas Jefferson Davis." He'd been told that he was been Thomas Jefferson by Edgar Cayce, and he said, "I'd like to invite you down for the weekend." And I didn't have anything else I was doing, and I was starting to write a novel, and I said, "Well, okay, I'll come on down." So I'd never been down there, and I drove down. It was about an hour and a half, 2 hours away. And I got there, and there was a kid up on a ladder who was putting up a sign for a shop, and I said, "I'm looking for T.J. Davis." And he said, "Well, he's not here, but Joan is." And around the way came this really lovely woman, beautiful lavender eyes. And she said, "I'm supposed to take you up to the ARE and introduce you to Edgar Cayce." And I said, "I don't know who Edgar Cayce is." And she explained to me what she understood, and, that he gave readings. And
The Sleeping
anyway,
Prophet, I think, is what he was called for.
Yeah, the Sleeping Prophet, exactly.
Yeah.
Anyway, we got up to the ARE and went into the building, what had been his old hospital building. He's the father of holistic medicine in the United States. And at random, I pulled up, we went into the library, and there was a wall of these loose leaf notebooks, like school green loose leaf notebooks. And at random, I just pulled one off and opened it up. And she was explaining to me what a reading was, which I didn't understand.
Mm-hmm.
And I opened this page up in this notebook, and it was a reading for a woman given in 1936. And in the reading, he said to her that she had been a member of the Essene community at Kirkwood Qumran, and that she was a teacher of astrology. And I must tell you, Zen, it is true that your hair can stand on end.
I know that one too. Absolutely.
Because
weird stuff.
Weird stuff. And because before I had gone into the service after I got drafted, the last thing I had done for National Geographic was research on the Dead Sea Scrolls. I knew, because I was quite knowledgeable about it, that in 1936 nobody knew that the Dead Sea Scrolls existed, or that Kirkwood Qumran was an Essene community. And what people did know about the Essenes, based on Josephus, an ancient commentator, was that it was a schismatic order of Jewish monks.
Mm-hmm.
No women were mentioned. And yet, in 1947, 11 years after he'd given this reading, a young Bedouin tribes boy who was chucking rocks into a cave heard something go clunk and went down and discovered the urns, which contained what we now call the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Right.
And when they were translated, it was revealed that they were obsessed with astrology. And when they did excavations, they discovered that Kirkwood Qumran was, in fact, the site of an Essene community, and that women's skeletons were found in the cemetery. So I thought, how is it possible that this man, while he was in a trance, could possibly know something that no human on earth knew until 11 years later?
Tapped into the one mind, the resource of the infinite intelligence and records of everything, right?
Yeah, that's easy to say, but at the time. Anyway, I said to her, I have some questions. And that began, I decided I was fascinated. I decided I would read all the readings from the first one to the last one. And I did. It took me about 4 years. And and then after I'd been doing it for a couple of years with the help from Hughlin Cayce, Cayce's eldest son, and Gladys Davis, the archivist and the woman who had taken down all the shorthand transcriptions of these readings.
So you probably also know Gladys McGarry.
I knew Gladys McGarry quite well, yes.
Yeah. She came here to Phoenix to spread the word, so to speak.
Yes, she did. And when I was in Tucson, I lived in Tucson when I wrote my first book. She was my doctor.
Ah, wonderful woman. Absolutely
Oh
wonderful
yeah,
woman.
yes, I've
And
known
there's
her. I've
also
known her
another
for.
gentleman you may have known there, Don Schminke. Does that name
The
ring a
name is
bell?
familiar. Yeah,
He was one of the gifted guys that got led to the clinic as well, or the foundation actually, because of his studies of consciousness.
yeah. Well, that was anyway. I was reading the readings, and about 2 years into it, I decided I ought to find out what science knew about this. So I started reading all of the parapsychological journals from the first one up to that time. This was now about 1967. And in 1968, I started experimenting and created what today we call remote viewing. I called it distant viewing at the time.
Right.
And wrote a book called The Secret Vaults of Time, which is about all the research that was done using remote viewing in archaeology before I began. And I got interested in archaeology because at that I come out of that background, an anthropological background, and because at that time most archaeological sites were found serendipitously. Somebody plowing
As
through
if it
the
was supposed to happen, right? Now, if we could just back up just a little bit, I want to unpack your initial dive into remote viewing and the out of body experiences and the things that go along with that. When you first began to have the experiences that led you to the understanding, I know that they happen quite serendipitously and synchronistically in a lot of cases. But do you recall what was going through your mind as your being was going through this introduction into being able to have a point of reference outside of your body?
That's not what happened.
Okay.
Um,
How did
what
you
happened?
experience that?
What happened was I became interested in consciousness, and I remembered a quote from Max Planck, an interview that he gave in 1931 for the Observer newspaper. Planck was the father of quantum
Our
mechanics.
quantum physics, right? Or quantum
Yeah,
computing, eventually, right? Came up with Planck's constant.
yeah. So um, he gave an interview in 1931. Uh, he didn't give very many interviews, and they asked him, you and Einstein are the two most famous scientists in the world. What do you know? And he said something that I am sure they did not anticipate. He
Nothing.
said, what I know is that consciousness is causal and fundamental. You cannot get behind consciousness. Space-time arises from consciousness, not consciousness from space-time.
Mm-hmm. Kind of like what
And,
Neppe and Close finally ended up with in the tethering of consciousness, space, and time across dimensions.
well, again,
I thought you might be familiar with their work too.
no, I'm familiar with the work. I don't agree with it.
Okay.
Um, what I got interested in, the reason I tell you the Planck story, is that I had witnessed a near-death experience when I was 12 years old. And it had stayed with me all my life.
Mm-hmm.
And
As it would.
as it would, yes, I witnessed a girl have a near-death experience. You could, in those days, on Saturdays when it wasn't school, you could scrub up and sit behind your father in the operating room. It was kind of a recruitment program, I think.
Yeah.
And um, and so one day I did that, and uh, they brought in the patient. And when I got into the room, she was already there. I didn't know who it was. It wasn't anybody I knew. And as they were beginning the surgery, suddenly something happened, and I didn't understand what it was. They all got very agitated, and then after a while, it seemed to work out. But they didn't do the surgery, which was unusual. And they, after a little while, they realized it was a young woman. They pulled the sheets off that were covering her, and I could see her breasts. And of course, you're a 12-year-old boy, breasts are get your attention. And
Sure.
they wheeled her in. My dad wheeled her into the recovery room. They put her, got her off the table and put her on a gurney and took her in. And she said to him, apparently, I went and showered and got cleaned up, and my dad was waiting for me when I got out. And I said, "What happened?" And he said, "Well, it's very strange." And he then said, "Well, we're going to go have lunch with these other doctors." So we went to this delicatessen where the doctors went and had lunch. And he said to them, she said to me, "I tried to get you all to pay attention to me, but you wouldn't listen to me." And she said, after a while, I was out of my body and I went out into I could see myself on the surgical table. I went out into the hallway where there was a nurse, and she described the nurse and her hairdo, which she particularly liked. And she said, and she was flirting with a young doctor who had a blue and white striped shirt on, and told my father all this, and he had gone out, and there was such a nurse, and there was a young resident with a blue and white shirt. So we're at the delicatessen, and he's telling this story, and one by one, these doctors, who were all vets from the Second World War, went around the room telling essentially what we today would call near-death experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't know what to make of that. And as we were driving home, I said to my father, what is that? I mean, I don't get it. How could you get out of your body and see things you couldn't? And he said, well, science is as much an art as a science. We just don't know everything.
And it used to be called philosophy until the 14th century.
Yeah. And so I had an interest in consciousness. And as I began reading the Cayce readings and realized all senses reported, he's not out of his body. That's not what's going on. What he's doing is opening to non-local consciousness.
Okay.
And I realized that he said other people could do it. And so in 1968, I designed an experiment. I built a grid in my backyard of this house I was renting at the time. And in this grid, I buried things that were in mason jars or in 35 millimeter film cans. And I made a mimeographed sheet of the chart of the grid. First there were 12, and then there were 144. And I asked people, I would send it out to people and ask them if they could describe which of the grid I had buried something in which grid, and if they could describe it, if they could first locate it and then describe it. And they could, which was fairly amazing to me.
Sure, not knowing that you don't know, and then all of a sudden,
yeah,
just imagining or allowing your mind, like you say, the non-local consciousness to kind of go out and gather that information and bring it back and deliver it.
Yeah, and they were able, as I say, to do it.
Sure.
So I decided that I was going to spend the rest of my life studying consciousness and how it worked, what it was. By that time, most people get into parapsychology, research in consciousness. They start with the premise, is it real? And most experiments are designed to prove, is it real on a statistical basis? But by the time I began to experiment, I didn't have any question that it was real.
Right.
What I wanted to know was, how did it work? What variables you could control to make it more efficient, and could you do anything of practical utility with it? And what was it telling us about who we were as humans and our place in the matrix of consciousness? And that's basically been my life work ever since.
And a wonderful life's work it is. I've been on a similar path, a little different than yours, in that mine, I was introduced to it experientially as opposed to questioning the reality of reality, which is one of the reasons why I asked about the Nepean Close model, the TDVP, in that for me, there was an experience I had in 1989. You may be familiar with a guy named William Swigard.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so his multi-level or multi-plane awareness technique I experienced in 1989. And so that 9 planes of consciousness that I went through, really, when I read at least the overview of Nepi and Close's work, it really resonated because it explained, at least in somewhat of a scientific way, what my direct experience was. That may not be inclusive, and I realize that, we're still kind of just scratching the surface in order to understand the magnitude that our consciousness actually has. And like you're saying, how do we make it practical? What can we tap into? How do we fully embody that non-local mind in the physical form? Has that been one of your questions?
Well, my questions have been what I said, and then and I became an experimentalist. I am an experimentalist,
Mm-hmm.
and I began using what I call distant viewing. Now we call it remote viewing. I began using it to find archaeological sites. So I found Cleopatra's Palace, Mark Antony's Palace, the Lighthouse of Pharos, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, one of Christopher Columbus's caravels. We solved murders with it, and I ran a research lab for over 20 years in Los Angeles, and began studying.
So that might have been Thelma Moss was one of your cohorts?
Thelma Moss was a friend, yes, absolutely.
Yeah, okay.
She was working at UCLA. So I, anyway, began doing that sort of work. And after a number of years, I realized that what we were seeing in the laboratory could be expanded or extended to look at it from a social perspective. And I realized that the key to the thing, all of it, was, first of all, the ability to attain and sustain intention-focused awareness. I started meditating in '64, and I've been a meditator ever since. I think
it does have its advantages, that's for sure.
Well, I think it's the greatest gift you can give yourself, to develop the discipline of meditation. But anyway, the ability to attain and sustain intention-focused awareness. And then I realized that every choice we make in life is essentially a vote for a certain kind of consciousness. And ultimately, I started doing research in that. And 4 times in my life, I've been involved with changing history, sometimes just as a little spear carrier, and sometimes in a more influential way. But in any case, and then in 2017, as you noted, I wrote a book called The 8 Laws of Change, because I got interested in how do you create a consciousness for a society, and it's done, as Gandhi said, one individual at a time. And so I realized that we needed to create a culture in which well-being at every level was the first priority, not profit.
Right. I totally agree with you. And part of the work that I'm doing, reflection of what you're saying, is that, especially with Live and Let Live, the global peace movement that I'm involved with, this is the kind of really core material that needs to be explored. So, we've got 2 rules: don't be an aggressor and be a good human. Well, this kind of falls under the be a good human, right? Where we're delving into what being human is really all about. And of course, everybody's got their own idea. We all agree that, yeah, being good humans a good thing, but what is it really? And because the deeper you dive, I think the more disagreements you get with perhaps even philosophical kinds of reasoning behind that. And yet there's this overarching consciousness that seems to be, and even validated by Valentina Morovina's work in the Soviet Union or Russia, She's a Russian academician, and just 2018, she put out, you're probably familiar with the dissertation called The Global Mutation of Humanity. Um, those kinds of things. Are you finding that, yeah, there is some science in the emergence of this extended or greater awareness of consciousness and the, what's euphemistically being called the ascension of humanity? Do you find those things that to be correlative in your work?
Well, um, what I have concluded and what I support again, I'm an experimentalist.
Mm-hmm.
So everything that I know about this subject can be objectively verified by experimental data. I'm not a
Sure.
philosopher. I'm not a speculator. I'm not a theoretician.
Yeah, well, Valentina's got 2 degrees, one in microbiology and one in astrophysics. So she's
Yeah,
definitely on the science side of things.
yes. Well, science is a way of developing objectively verifiable data.
Absolutely.
And what I have come away with is we need to create a culture which supports well-being, because systems and social policies which support well-being as the first priority are always cheaper, more efficient, more effective, more productive,
Yeah.
nicer to live under, more enduring, and as I said, let me say it again, much, much cheaper.
Which falls
So
under the non-aggressor category, because when you're aggressing on something, you're creating the strife. And what we're looking for, what it appears that you're looking for also, is some kind of a, for lack of a better, harmony among people and planet, where we're all in some kind of almost a Vedantic philosophy kind of, right, unitive consciousness, in that we're each those individual strands of intelligence that somehow learn how to work together better. That well-being that you're mentioning.
Yes, I mean, you learn eventually, if you do this sort of work, that all consciousness is interdependent and interconnected.
Right.
And so when you make a choice that does not foster well-being, that has some other priority, you end up disrupting the harmony of the balance. And just as we are disrupting the ecosystem, creating climate change, destroying the ecosystems of the ocean, and on and on and on, all of that is because choices were made on a basis of something other than well-being.
Sure. And even with that, go ahead. No, you wanted to finish that thought. I interrupted.
Well, I was going to say, it doesn't mean that you can't make a profit. This is not anti-profit. It's just that all profit has to be made by fostering well-being.
Absolutely. I put it into these terms. The old agenda was profit over people and planet.
Yeah.
The new one needs to be people and planet over profit. Doesn't eliminate the profit, just redirects it.
Yes.
It's like the structures that we have now and evolving into this well-being and this new consciousness that we're talking about doesn't necessarily change the physical structures of the world, or the fact that the earth is going through its own changes too. And sometimes we give ourselves more credit than we deserve in that regard. What it does mean is that how we deal with this is going to change. It's the interactive qualities, the well-being, the nurturing, the learning how to redesign, not necessarily redesign, but redirect the deliverables from the existing systems to actually serve humanity instead of serving a few.
Yes. Well, I mean, if you put consciousness as your first priority and well-being, then you make, for instance, very different technological choices.
Absolutely. Now, how do you see this, or what, even your recommendations, if you will, because I'm sure you've thought about this just a little bit. What are the hows and the whats? What have you come up with so far as what seems to be maybe a prudent path to take in achieving those deliverables you're talking about and raising the consciousness to the well-being level?
Well, I will tell you what I say to groups when I speak with them, and they say, "Well, what can we do?" I can give you this very simple task. Every day you make dozens of choices. You choose the toothpaste you use. You choose the gasoline you buy. You choose the cat food you buy. You choose all of those things. All of those are votes.
Right.
And you, as a citizen, an agent of change for well-being, you make the commitment that every day I have all these little choices I don't even think about mostly, but that from now on I will, of the options that are available to me as I understand them at that moment, I will always choose the option that is the most compassionate, life-affirming, and fostering of well-being. So I will only buy things from companies that are doing that sort of thing. I will only vote for people who are doing that sort of thing. I will only sponsor or contribute to organizations or foundations who are supporting that sort of thing. That is, I will always make, of the choices available to me, that choice. I will always choose that choice which is the most compassionate, life-affirming, and fostering of well-being.
Mm-hmm.
And if you really want to get serious about it, then you tell 10 of your friends that you're doing it as a discipline and invite them to do it. And if you do that, I don't know how many people listen to this podcast, but I can guarantee you that if the people who listen to this podcast will make this commitment, will do it themselves, invite 10 of their friends to do it, and invite 10 of their friends, that you could change the outcome of the election in November.
Tall order, and it can be done. I
Oh, it
agree.
absolutely can be done.
I agree. And based on my own experience. Now, also based on my own experience, people are lazy. They have a lot of apathy towards reality right now, as long as they're, happy in their own individualized compartment, their house, whatever, community. So if there were another, and what you're saying requires commitment, it requires doing research, taking the time that they would be spending elsewhere enjoying something to actually focus on something that matters. Let's say that people aren't able to do that. Is there another way that they can check in with that non-local intelligence in process?
Start meditating.
Okay. Is there
meditation? If you look at every religion in the world, this is a whole other conversation, you discover that in martial art dojos, Hindu temples, Lamistic monasteries, wherever, they always teach meditation. And
right.
The reason they teach meditation is that is how you can get in touch with the non-local aspect of your own consciousness. Everyone has access to it because we are ultimately creatures of creation by consciousness.
Right.
So
and that allows you for the mind management that opens the door so you can get access to the files you need.
Yes, and it will change your perspective.
Absolutely.
You change your perspective. And to give you a sense of what can be done with this, I give you this story about Mahatma Gandhi. Right before he was assassinated, he was interviewed by the Times of India, and they said to him, "Oh, Gandhiji, how were you able to get the British? How did you force the British, force, notice that verb,
right?
How did you force the British to give up their most precious colonial possession without a war? You have no money, you have no official position, you had no army. How did you do that?" And his answer is what we are discussing. He said, "It isn't what we did that mattered, although that did matter. It isn't what we said that mattered, although that also mattered. It was the nature of our character, what I would call beingness,
Mhm.
was the
I
nature
call
of
that
our
the God
beingness.
participle.
Yes,
Being is the
being
God participle.
that led the British to choose to leave India. I mean,
Mhm.
nobody talks very much about this, but this man got independence for India without a war. And it's
And we can do
almost to
that for the
me,
world, right?
yes,
By
that's right.
applying
And
these
so,
principles, that can actually happen. And by doing it in mass as rapidly as possible, it could even truncate the time frame for all of it to be done.
yes, exactly. As I said, if you support well being, if you support democracy, if you commit
True
to make,
democracy, it's kind of been
yes,
made a mockery of.
yes, if you support those things and you make the commitment that every choice you make will be supportive of compassion, life affirming, and fostering well being, and tell your friends you're doing it. As I said, the people that are listening to this program right now have the power to completely change the election.
Yes,
And
they
you can
do.
work it out mathematically. You start with 10 people, and then you have 100 people, and then you have 1,000 people, and pretty soon it only takes about six
Right.
generations away. You're talking about millions of people.
Now that's network marketing at its best, isn't it?
Yes.
Right. Now, also, I want to ask you this to go, let's go into the sensory side of things, because we've been talking pretty much above the shoulders until now. What I'd like to do is ask you about what goes on in the body as far as its recognition. And I want to particularly focus on the indigenous philosophy of the three brains that I'm sure you're familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
So at a gut level, the first brain, what would one experience in the vibratory realm that we're connected to as evidence that they are indeed connected?
Well,
Is that
I
a
would
fair
say to
question?
you, yeah, I would say to you, if you do this, what I'm describing, and you become a daily meditator, very soon you will change your diet. You know, one of the things that makes Americans stand out when you go overseas is that all the fat people are Americans.
Yeah.
Obesity is a huge problem in the United States. You go to France or Italy or Japan, or you don't see that kind of obesity in
Even
other
Russia.
countries. So you change the way you eat. You would probably uh, you would stop eating pre-prepared foods. But I mean, it's not something that you are forced to do. It will seem like the right thing to do, and your internal psychology will be, oh yes, that's what I want to do.
Mm-hmm.
You
Good.
will you will make different choices in terms of the things you support, where your interests lie, for instance. You will you will have a different view about racial equality, about gender equality, because your whole consciousness will change once you begin to recognize that consciousness is causal and fundamental. It
Exactly.
isn't that you have to do anything. If you will take up meditation and you will make this commitment about these choices, all the rest of it just naturally flows because you choose to do it, and it becomes the obvious thing to do.
Mm-hmm. And you allow others to be themselves without aggressing on
Yes,
your moral character on them. It's I am and you are able to choose what's best for each of us, regardless of what the other thinks, and that we're both, because we've developed that psychological safety and intellectual humility in conversation and living, we allow the others. We encourage and hopefully invite others to experience something different, like you have here with the request for the audience to just try meditating for a bit. And then because of that, you know, it doesn't happen quickly, but with the discipline that you mentioned, it gradually begins to allow the body to communicate with the brain. And
Yes.
because we're a little more conscious of the process, that gut level, the heart, the second brain moves up to the third brain, which is where we make better choices because we have better information as we are attempting to tune in to that, which that non-linear, non-local information that's available, simply because we're putting our attention, intention, and interaction toward it.
Yes.
Now,
Yes.
how can we do that on a, even you're talking on a you know, the daily practice of meditation, things like that. Are there opportunities that we have in our daily travails where we can plug in a moment of stillness somehow? Are there, you know, are there tasty tidbits of tricks that we can tantalize our tendrils with in order to find that place of solace in that
Well,
non-local?
I'll tell you what Paul Desjardins told me. Every morning when you take a shower, you commit yourself that you will be an agent of change fostering well-being. And you will act in accord with the deepest impulses and understandings that you have. Every day when you take a shower, you essentially baptize yourself into the recommitment.
Now that sounds phenomenally simple.
Oh,
Right?
it's all very simple. And you don't put anything into your mouth without stopping to give thanks. And again, you make the choices that foster well-being. So every time you put something in your mouth, you stop and basically say a kind of grace over it.
Mm-hmm.
And you spend 20 minutes a day in meditation. And those three things will, over the course of a couple of years, utterly transform your life.
And now that's the one thing that we seem to be up against is the muck enlightenment generation, right? They want to go through the drive-through and pick up something on their way home. What kind of consideration can we offer those types, which are probably the majority in America right now, maybe not so much around the world, but as you already mentioned, we're the obese ones. What kind of difference can we make in their lives by helping them to adjust, or at least maybe consider something that's an alternative?
Well, you have to make this commitment. I mean, it's really that simple. These are really simple little things. You know, you don't have to talk about them. You don't have to, it doesn't require a lot of study. It doesn't
Doesn't
cost
really require much
anything.
except your choice in doing so, and then the discipline to follow up, right?
Yes, well, you have to make those choices.
Right.
There is no drive-through way in which you awaken. It's a commitment that you make. I would like to know who I am and what I am about, and I can, through these three simple things, I can gain that insight. I can gain that wisdom. It doesn't cost me anything. It doesn't require that you went to a particular school. It doesn't matter what race you are. It doesn't matter what gender you are. It doesn't matter what your social economic status is. Everybody is capable of doing this. The question is, do you want to do it?
Right. Well, and the other angle, you know, when I had my experience as a teen, it was a moment, I prayed to know what truth was. I was willing to die for it if necessary. And lo and behold, a few days later, I was asked if I was willing to do so. And by my commitment to that, my first thought of what I believed in was Christ consciousness, it felt a little empty for some reason, didn't question it. I moved on to cosmic consciousness. That felt full. And so I said yes. And then next thing I know, I'm out of body, I'm in the light. And then I'm flippantly asking if there's more. And I'm in a indigo background with spheres of, with a points of light surrounding me, kind of like a sphere. And then given my marching orders and coming back, I recognized that first, there is no death because I could still think in those places and be aware and be interactive. And that by coming back, then I recognized that we're all cosmic consciousness condensed into form as that point of light, and access is always there. We're just unaware of it. Yes. And so these kinds of practices actually implement that connective tissue, if you will, that spans the non-local mind, however many dimensions that may be, whether it's, you know, the mind of Close and Nepi and Swigert or not. The interesting thing is that with those same dimensions or planes, there's also some other models that seem to indicate the same thing, like the solfeggio tones, and how they each provide, even just with the experience of sitting with the tone, it changes you.
Yes.
Now,
well,
those
there are a lot of paths up the mountain, but it's all the same mountain.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's the interesting thing, is that, you know, it doesn't matter how you find it. The fact is that, or the blessing is you find it. And then how do you share that with others so that you're not prescriptive in the methodology? Now, how might you address that? Because we tend to, and we've been inundated and programmed by most belief systems as following a prescriptive path, which we find out today doesn't work. It does to a certain extent, but it doesn't when you got those purveyors of truth, if you will. It doesn't fit, because we each have our own individual experience of that. It's how we build that collectively that matters. So how do you see that collective building as a potential, or even as a probable, in the coming years?
Well, the only way we're going to get through climate change is by restructuring our society so that it fosters well-being. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, the amount of death and pain and misery that is going to attend climate change is just almost unimaginable.
Now, do you associate climate change with Earth changes as well? Because the Earth's going through its own changes too, and we're kind of exacerbating the process by our own behavior.
Well, the Earth is a dynamic system, and so it's doing what it's doing. But what's happened is that by the choices that we have made, which are based on profit, not on well-being, we have disrupted and destroyed the normal functional dynamics of the Earth to such a degree that we are about to face, for instance, where you live, I think most of Arizona is going to become unlivable by 2040, 2045. If you live along a coast, for instance, I would begin thinking about how much longer I could own that property before the real estate values completely collapsed.
Or the ring of fire
where
gets ignited.
Yeah, in Arizona where you are, you're not going to be able to maintain functional cities at 119 degrees a day for 150 days of the year, or where you don't have any water, and you look at what's happening to the Colorado River, or Lake Powell or Lake Mead. So we're going to have 3 big migrations in the United States away from coasts and river deltas because of sea rise, out of the Southwest because heat and because of lack of water, and out of the central states because of, in some cases, heat, but also because of cataclysmic weather events like tornadoes occurring again and again.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I was in Oklahoma. I'd spoken at a conference of doctors, and they were having a dinner for the speakers, and I was put next to a city councilman who was a very strong, I'm trying to think of a polite way to put this,
That was a
conservative.
long, pregnant pause.
Yeah, conservative.
Okay.
And I asked him, what he thought about climate change, and he said, "I don't believe it. It's all not. It's all, it's all a scam to get us to do certain things." I said, "Really? What does concern you?" And he said, "Well, what we're worrying about right now, this is a city councilman, what we're worried about right now is how many times do you rebuild a town?" And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, we have a town that has been destroyed by tornadoes 3 times. And it's clearly in the path of tornadoes. So how many times do we rebuild that town?
Yeah, how
Or
many
do we
times
just
do you get kicked
abandon it?
upside the head before you actually move so you
Yeah,
don't get kicked?
exactly. Exactly. So, I mean, he didn't believe in climate change, but he was faced with the reality of what climate change was doing to the area in the state where he was, and that's
Kind of seems
what's going to happen.
unfathomable
So,
to, for you and I, right? You've got that obvious evidence and we're able to see it from a different level, and they're looking at it from more of a linear space as opposed to non-linear or non-local, in just, okay, well, we're here, we're not going to change that, we just got to keep continually rebuilding. That is so destructive to the evolutionary process.
yeah, you can't keep, you cannot, we have to move out of the carbon age. Now, there's a lot of good news that's coming on that. Some states like California have committed by 2040, no carbon powered engines. It's really the end of the internal combustion machine
Mm-hmm.
of whatever type. So most of the countries of Europe and some in Asia have committed by 2040 they will have no carbon powered vehicles on their roads. That's all good news. We're
It
beginning
is
to
for the
see,
people who are able to purchase new vehicles and things like that, but for the majority of people that still have the fossil fuel burning vehicles, that, it mitigates the future, but it doesn't do anything about the present for the cleaning up, and the
yeah,
retro.
well,
Because that's, I think, I've done a lot of thinking about this, is how do you retrofit fossil fuel vehicles to make them more fuel efficient inexpensively?
well, I don't,
That's
inexpensive. I mean, average cars, people keep them about 10 years. What I can tell you is I have been getting, I've now had 4,000 and 2,000, 6,000 people I've gotten to remote view either the year 2050 or the year 2060.
mm-hmm.
It's a whole long, this is another whole subject, but
Sure, sure.
um, what I get from them is that between 2040 and 2045, we're going to have some really cataclysmic change. I'm not quite sure what it's going to be, but what I think it's going to be at this moment of doing the analysis of the data, I mean, I've got about 10,000 pages of data I'm
Mm-hmm.
analyzing, um, is the end of the internal combustion machine. That's one thing. Um, a complete restructuring of employment. Nobody talks about big skyscrapers full of office buildings or offices. They talk about basically what we think of as remote work now.
Right. And we've got a real good introduction to that with coming out of, in and coming out of COVID.
Yes, COVID, and that was the next thing I was going to say. And I think we're going to have a series of these pandemics when I started in the 2050 data with the original work in '78, I left government. I had been special assistant to Chief of Naval Operations for research and analysis. And when I left government in '76, I thought we were going to have a nuclear war. And so did most of the people in the geopolitical world that I was living in at that point. And most people thought, either by accident or by
Volition.
Volition, we were going to have a nuclear war. And I had a young daughter, so I began doing this remote viewing experiment to get people to look at the year 2050 on the same date as they were doing their remote viewing session. And one of the things, I mean, this is a long series of things, but I mean, they told me that the Soviet Union would disappear, which in 1978, nobody thought the Soviet Union was going to disappear.
Right.
And I said to them, one of the things I asked them about was healthcare. And they said, well, there's going to be a series of pandemics that are going to kill millions of people. And I said, oh, yes, really? And they said, oh, yes, the first one will be a blood disease which crosses over from primates to humans, and it's going to kill millions of people. And of course, 78, 79, 80, I went around to a friend of mine who was the deputy director of National Institutes of Health and asked him, do you know anything about a blood disease that crosses over from primates to humans that has the potential to kill millions of people? And he said, whatever it is you're smoking, Stephan, quit. Because that's nonsense. No, I don't know anything about such a thing. And of course, in '81, HIV emerged and killed 35 million people. And then SARS, and then H5N1,
Right.
and now we're going through COVID. And as climate change goes on, the viruses and bacteria are going to mutate. And so we're not going to have any resistance. So I think we're going to have a series of these pandemics like this that are going
So is this almost a natural culling of the population that's happening because we haven't been following the precepts put forth in the Vedas and the Rig Vedas 15,000 years ago? It's finally caught up with us?
Yeah, basically.
Okay.
I mean, basically what's going to happen from what I can see and from what has happened in the past is that these things are going to mutate. The 2050, 2060 people all talk about that healthcare is very different. But as I said, 2040 to 2045, that 5-year period, which is not very far in the future if you think about it for a minute,
Right.
is going to be a really deeply transitional. Different technologies will develop or have developed. Different healthcare has developed. A reorientation of society has occurred because climate change is not going to allow us to continue doing
Right.
the kind of unconscious things that we're doing.
Now, are you of the mind that in the viewing of the future, it's based on present conditions? And by changing present conditions, that future vision will also change? Or do you feel that that's cast?
What do you mean by present conditions?
The mindset or or lack of mindset in humanity.
Oh, that's going to all
currently.
have to change.
Okay, but what I'm asking is, one of the things that people from elsewhere told Wilbert Smith, that I'm sure you're familiar with, was that their idea of time is the measurement in the change of entropy. So with this budding awareness from meditating, focusing attention, intention, and interaction towards well-being, then that could indeed truncate the time frame and actually fit into this phase into the new era, the age of Aquarius, right? You were talking about astrology and the fascination that you have with it, and that others do as well. So these kinds,
not my fascination.
right? sorry, I didn't want to allude that you're
Yeah,
fascinated
scene
with it, but you did
fascination.
say that the scenes were fascinating. Well, maybe they were that way for a reason. We don't understand that yet.
Yeah,
So, because all of these things have significance, and there's a reason why these ancient cultures paid attention to them. And we seem
yeah,
to have forgotten all of that with modern science in thinking that, kind of like Einstein says, we're trying to solve the same problems with the thinking that created them. And that doesn't work.
no, the
So
thinking
if
is
we
all is
open our
going to have to
minds up,
change.
yeah, well, that's what I'm saying. Is it, are you of the mind then to, or ascribe to the philosophy that given current conditions, changing that future view would also change dramatically or could? For instance, this came up as you were talking. Um, what was it? I'm trying to remember the guy that channeled the I Am America map years ago, that 25 or almost 30 years after that came out, a naval disaster scenario map actually was released, and it was the same thing. So to me, that told me, oh, this guy was probably privy to other information that nobody else did, and because of his access to it, he couldn't say where it came from, and so it was channeled by him, and then everybody, not everybody, but many people kind of bought into that. And that may be so. I mean, it shows Arizona as being beachfront territory at that point, right?
That's not
uh,
what's going to happen.
well, we don't know. That's the point. We do not know beyond a shadow of a doubt what the future is going to be, because we have the ability of change. Now, how
Well,
we bring that change,
yes, yes and no. We don't know exactly what the future is going to be, but we know what the trends are, and you can
from a
objectively
planetary basis,
evaluate the
yes.
trends.
Now, what about the others? Because there's obvious visitations. The military's finally said yes. There are craft here we don't know about. We don't know how they function. Blah blah blah. And yet there's a whole group of people that seem to be in contact with like Wilbert Smith, that are saying, hey, these guys are saying we need to learn how to work together better. And then they
Well,
will help, but not until. So here's massive amounts of technology we don't even comprehend or can even understand, let alone um, deal with, especially with the nonlinear, non-local moments that these kinds of events have or produce with humans. So we're not even thinking about those kinds of possibilities into how that might affect our future too. We're simply looking at what we are as a planetary civilization, where we can go without other influences, right?
well, yes. I mean, I have been interested in the unidentified aerial phenomena and all that. I've known most of the people that were the researchers on it,
Mm-hmm.
and I think uh, back in the 1970s, I organized at the American Anthropological Association a panel on what anthropologists thought about this. So I've been at this a long time,
No,
back
me
to
too.
the, back to the 50s with Donald Kehoe. Um, but in any case, I think that they are behaving like cultural anthropologists. I think that what they recognize is that all cultures, wherever, whatever species, that develop technology get to a point where the technology is either going to destroy them or they're going to change. And that's where we are.
Right.
We're at a place where if we continue with the technologies and the choices we're making, there's a very real chance we're not going to make it.
And a lot of,
Or we're going to change. We're going to change the choices we make, the technologies we make, the way we structure our societies. We're going to foster well-being from the smallest being to humans, and so that fostering well-being becomes the first priority, and that will produce a very different world.
Hmm.
And we're
Now,
at that turning point, and they are watching us because we're at that turning point. They're doing exactly what a cultural anthropologist would do if he was studying a primitive tribe on some island.
well, we kind of are a primitive tribe on some island in space, right?
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, we think we're so advanced, but we really aren't because we're not part of any kind of galactic federation or anything like that yet. We're still planet focused and mostly human centric.
Yeah.
We're not even considering being other centric at this time. Um, so, do you see evidence of this change that we're talking in a positive way, the latter part of your scenario? Do you see evidence that this change is indeed happening, and how
Oh,
does
yes.
that appear in ways that are obvious to others so that maybe we can begin to say, hey, let's look over here instead of over there, right?
Oh, yes. I mean, if you look at, for instance, uh, again, the carbon energy era, you can see countries all over the world and in the United States and certain states are making deep commitments to non-carbon energy production. That's a positive trend. That's one of the
Hmm.
positive trends. You can see that industrial, chemical, monoculture agriculture is beginning to fail, and people are beginning to question uh, whether there are alternative ways, and holistic, biodynamic, organic kind of agriculture
Right. So
is
they're
beginning.
questioning big pharma, both the
Yeah,
pH and the F,
all of that, all
right?
of that. Yes, so I see lots of good trends. I see some trends nobody talks very much about. I'm very concerned about the development of another hominid species, because the CRISPR technology that has developed over the last 15, 20 years is going to give us the ability to alter our genetic structure. And I think it's already going on,
Isn't
particularly
that
in
what
Asian
the
countries.
vaccines were about with the mRNA? The messenger RNA that was in that was actually to make a change.
You mean in COVID vaccines?
Yeah.
No, that's no,
Okay. It's something I've heard, and
no.
when there's a messenger RNA, that kind of makes people
No, I
go,
know,
well,
I know,
gosh,
I
what's
know.
going on there? And there are
No,
some
no,
questions.
that's,
So you're saying that's inconsequential.
I'm saying that most of it is bogus.
Okay. Uh,
What is quite real, and you can do your own research. Again, I'm an experimentalist.
right.
All I look at is data.
Okay.
You look at what's going on, you can see, and you see this particularly in the Asian countries because they don't have the same social restrictions that are here, particularly in China. Um, if you could um, genetically alter and have it as a gene line so that it passed on from generation to generation, that um, you didn't get cancer, you didn't get heart disease, you didn't develop diabetes.
Hmm.
If you could tailor a child who was as smart as Einstein, as athletic as, I don't know, Michael Jordan, as attractive as, I don't know, pick your favorite movie star, um, and your children would be like that, and they would never get cancer. They would have an IQ of 160. They would be physically,
Right. I get that.
you
So
know,
what you're saying is
and
this
it would
is
be, well, let me just finish. And it would
sure.
get started, as it will, mostly amongst the rich because they can afford to do it. And another Homo sapien, what I call Homo superior, developed. I am very concerned about that because I see it happening,
Sure.
and I don't see anybody talking about it. And another part of that is, how many human genes do you have in order to be a human. If you look at the creation of chimeras, if you look at the medical literature and the ethicists of medical research, you'll see there's an increasing concern about blending animal and human genetics. And, you know, how many human genes does it take to be a human?
Right.
That's also an issue.
And the experimentations, they go, can we do this? I don't know. Let's try and find out. Those kinds of things can really run amok. Now, what you're saying with and it seems to be more of engineered path for the species of humans that you mentioned. And then there's also another side of that where it would seem that the natural evolutionary process of well-being would also produce a superior human over time. And so you've got these two that are parallel, if you will. And is there a competition between those two, or will there be a collaboration between the two? And I think we really don't know until the future turns out and we can figure it out.
Well, my hope is that a change in consciousness will bring these into conformance or into agreement. When I talk to the people about 2050 and 2060, I've been asking questions about this. I mean, one of the things, I was part of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Secretary of Defense discussion group on innovation, technology, and the future back in the 70s. And at that time, the great fear was overpopulation and exhaustion of natural resources.
Right.
And most futurists, that's
still
what they're
is
writing about. You remember the Paul Ehrlich
oh yeah,
all that sort of thing. I don't hear a single person telling me that overpopulation is an issue. So clearly something is going to happen with the population. Now, there are a number of things that are going on. American men, for instance, have declining sperm counts. American women are having children later or not having children. So that's one thing. We do not have a sustainable birth rate in the United States.
And the birth rates of other countries have declined because of the programs that have been instituted in order to do so.
Yeah, most of Europe. Well, the Chinese are paying a horrible price because of their one-child policy, and the fact that what they didn't calculate was that the cultural view favored boys, male babies, and so they now have a number of million of men who will never be able to marry because there aren't enough women, and it has distorted the whole population.
Ethnically the same, right? And of course they got to go elsewhere.
Yeah, so they got a huge problem that they're dealing with. But what I ultimately am softly optimistic.
Okay.
That we, if we started, for instance, and there again, I'm an experimentalist. I'm all about data.
Data can be read also. We have to acknowledge that data can be read different ways depending on the eyes looking.
Yes, in some ways. But if you look at the data, for instance, you find that if you started teaching children to meditate when they were in about the 6th grade, and you began doing it every day as part of the school curriculum, you get very different people. For instance, in San Francisco, there were 4 schools that had the lowest functioning evaluation. That is, the most dropouts, the most violence, the most drug use. I mean, all those negatives. And they opened up really quite brilliant. They began a meditation program in these schools. And these are all kids who mostly came from poverty, violence, racism, all of those, the negatives. And they began meditating every day. And what they discovered was the school dropout list, the rate dropped enormously, drug usage dropped enormously, violence dropped enormously. In fact, it was so dramatic that when a new administration in the school system came in and tried to eliminate this program, the students rebelled and rose up as a group, said, no, you've got to allow us to continue to do this, and they do. So what would happen if we taught all kids to meditate, not from a religious perspective, but just from a mindfulness perspective?
Right.
If we emphasized compassionate, life-affirming well-being as the first choice, as an example, as opposed to aggression and all the things you mentioned.
Teach them how to hit the pause button before they're, in that temptation to aggress, to learn how to hit the pause button and take a breath and reflect and say, wait a minute, I have a choice here. I don't have to do that, because the tendency is when you're aggressed upon, you want to aggress, right? Because that's kind of how that energy works. And so it takes a more conscious, mindful approach to recognize that and go, oh, wait a minute, this really isn't about me. The other person is just having a bad day. I just need to help them through whatever situation they're in. And then learning the skills to do that too, to move that towards well-being.
Well, if you begin to focus on those sorts of things, if you teach in schools, emphasizing creating new technologies which support well-being, you'd get a very different set of technologies at every level, and you can already see this happening.
Well, Australia started the holistic education program a couple of decades ago.
Yes.
I even wrote a business plan for a model for here after teaching high schools for almost a decade in several different scenarios, charter schools as well. It was way ahead of its time. It still is. However, the holistic education aspect of it, we don't assess the kids. We don't find out what their aptitudes, their skill sets, their natural proclivities are, and nurture those. They do in Russia. That's how my wife grew up. She wanted to be a pianist and proved that she had the ability and the acumen, and she was nurtured throughout the whole system. Why don't we do that? So no, we'd rather point fingers at Russia and think they're an enemy instead of looking at what they do that's positive and learning how to adapt our own ways to that. Now, in this process though, where does cognitive bias come in?
Where does what?
Cognitive bias. How does that get in the way? It just was something that, we have, like I mentioned, looking at the data, and depending on the eyes that are looking, you can interpret it differently, because there's generally some cognitive bias that isn't, that's present, that's maybe unrecognized. Would you have a cognitive bias that you're aware of, that, the optimistic side, perhaps? I know I do. I'm always looking at the brighter way. Yeah. Okay.
Well, Zen, I've got to wrap this up because I've got another appointment.
Okay.
At 3 o'clock.
Well, I do appreciate, we've gone over generally a very deep discussion. I really enjoyed it, Stephan, and I appreciate the work that you do, and I'm sure our audience does as well. You've shared a lot of things for folks to think about deeply and make some changes in their own lives.
Good. Well, glad to do it. Happy to be a part of your group, your podcast, and everybody stay safe and well and foster well-being. That's my final thought.
All right, great. Thanks, Stephan. And namaste and in lak'ech. Thanks for sticking with us for this episode of One World in a New World. I'm Zen Benefiel, your host, and I will see you next time.